Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. I've been really looking forward to recording this interview because joining me today is the author of a new book about British politics that has made me rethink what I thought I knew. It also has some delightfully acerbic captions on the photos in the book, which is titled Serpents, Goats and Turkeys, A Century of Liberal Labour Relations. And the author is former Liberal Democrat MP and Minister David Lloyd. Welcome to the show, David.
Very good to be with you, Mark.
Now, this is your second book that sort of ventured further back in time into Britain's history, and your first was about the death of Lord Kitchener. And now this book, although it runs up to 2024, starts back off in 1903. So what got you into this interest in writing books that are at least in part history books?
Yeah, I suppose really that my first love when I all the way back at school days was history as a subject rather than economics, which I did at university, or politics. History was my first love, really, and I can't understand why history isn't everybody's favorite subject. It just is such a fascinating area to read about all the incredible things that have happened.
You're talking to somebody with a history PhD, so absolutely,
Yes.
we're on the same page.
Talking to the converted, but yeah, it doesn't compute with me that there are some people that don't enjoy history, and it doesn't compute with me that people would want to read fiction when they can read just as fascinating things that actually happened. And I suppose also when I was young, I found in one of the drawers at home the war medals of my grandfather from the First World War, and that also sparked an interest in military history. So history and military history are a great passion for me. And I suppose once I then became interested in politics, I got a bit diverted along the way by economics and other things. But the recent book brings those two interests together in history and politics.
And just to digress briefly about the Lord Kitchener book, I found that fascinating, looking at his death during the First World War and the conspiracy theories that spun out as a result of it, because that feels like that could be a story that happened this week, in terms of all of these fears around fake news, grifters making money out of deliberately, punting around stories that aren't true and so on. It felt, in a sense, the very best sort of history that feels very relevant to the questions that we're grappling with today. But I think you got into that topic in part, didn't you, because of your role as a minister and deciding what papers to release. Is that right?
I wasn't involved in decisions over the release of papers. I just always thought that, firstly, Kitchener was an absolutely fascinating figure. He was one of the sort of superstar generals of the late Victorian period. Then, of course, went on to become war minister in the First World War. But also the whole story, as you mentioned, of his demise was fascinating. The range of conspiracy stories and the seriousness with which many of them were taken. Many of them were raised, as you know, in the House of Commons by supposedly serious MPs. So it does show us that, the propensity for dubious stories, for making up stuff, that's not just a sort of modern phenomenon. And the story of Kitchener and the conspiracy theories is an interesting warning about how easy it's been in all periods of history for people to end up making up stories without much basis in fact.
And it's the sort of thing that actually quite often gives me a bit of optimism, particularly when, for example, if anyone is ever bemoaning the state of politics, you only have to look at the sort of things that was considered acceptable in 19th century election campaigns in terms of, say, the levels of open religious bigotry, to think actually, maybe not everything is getting worse than it used to be. But I'll include a link to the Kitchener book in the show notes for readers. But let's get to your new book. So what made you, obviously things like, the history of the Liberal Party, history of the Labour Party as well, loads of books published on all of them. What was the gap that you saw that made you think, oh yeah, this would be a fun and interesting book to write?
In a way, I thought there were two gaps. One is that we've got some very good histories of British politics, obviously going back over a long period of time, but not many that have looked not just at individual parties, but at the relationship between two parties. So this really, although obviously it brings in the Conservative Party, because you can't tell the story of Lib-Lab relations without some discussion of the Conservatives, it looks at that relationship, and there are not many volumes that do that. It also is designed to be explicitly an opinionated history. So sometimes you read stories of the Lib Lab Pact or the deal between Gladstone and McDonnell back in 1903, and they're recounted in a sort of factual way, but without an opinion about whether the parties were making sensible judgments in doing those things. So I wanted quite an opinionated history where I ended up commenting on whether the parties did intelligent things in retrospect or not, and also trying to draw quite solid conclusions from what's happened over that period of history, which ought to be informing the parties at a time when we've got a Labour Party back in government again. So I certainly was thinking that, that the background to this was likely to be another Labour government fairly soon at the time when I was writing the book, and that I suppose makes it more interesting and topical.
Yeah, and you certainly managed the opinionated bits, I think, in a really good way. And David Lloyd George, I think it's probably fair to say, is not one of your political heroes. He comes out particularly badly of your critiques, but I think in a way that is really helpful because particularly when you talk about things like the coupon election that David Lloyd George negotiated. So, he was in power in coalition with the Conservatives, negotiates a seat pact. The thing that always puzzles me when reading most accounts is you look at the number of David Lloyd George Liberal candidates who would get a coupon and think, well, even if everything went brilliantly with this seat deal, how on earth is he going to end up being Prime Minister in the long term? Because he's basically agreeing a seat deal which either will fail or all but guarantees there will be more Tory MPs than David Lloyd George supporters. And how is he going to end up staying as Prime Minister in the long term? And yet most accounts will just give you the numbers and not any, does this number make sense? Why does he agree this number? In a way that, I think you come to a slightly similar view to mine of actually, when you start thinking about the politics of it, it's quite hard to see how that was ever going to work out for him. But more generally, you're not a fan of David Lloyd George, or at least after having research for the book. Is that fair to say?
That might be slightly unfair. I mean, what I find, there's a line in The Great Gatsby that talks about the narrator being simultaneously attracted and repelled by what he sees. And I feel that about David Lloyd George in the same way that I do reading Robert Caro's volumes about Lyndon Johnson, that most of the time you loathe the man, but there are times when you wonder whether actually he isn't using brutal political power to achieve good things. And that's what makes Lloyd George a fascinating and tricky figure, that, in many senses, he was a really serious, radical advocate of intervention in economic and social policy to improve the lot of people who otherwise would have been let down by the type of society that we had 100 or so years ago. And he was one of the few liberals who had the opportunity to transition the party from its 19th century form to the form it needed to have in the 20th century to really ever be able to be competitive with Labour. The problem with him is that he was a very self-obsessed and highly disloyal individual, disloyal to his family, disloyal to his senior colleagues, including Asquith, and I suppose most seriously disloyal to his party in a way that was designed, to, I suppose, if you look at the most generous interpretation, was designed to focus on ends rather than means, but ultimately wrecked both by wrecking the Liberal Party. So I can understand why Roy Jenkins could never bring himself to write a biography of Lloyd George, because he, I think, rather loathed him. But I can see the good things about Lloyd George as well. I just think the personal disloyalty towards all of those around him is difficult to forgive, and of course was absolutely fatal to the Liberal Party 100 or so years ago, and arguably more than any other single factor helped Labour to displace the Liberals and usher in a period of two-party government that we weren't part of.
Yeah, and there's an interesting parallel, I guess, with Boris Johnson, in that I think many of the things you've said about David Lloyd George, could and are said about Boris Johnson, but definitely there is a degree of seriousness about policy delivery that makes a major change to people's lives. I mean, I guess fans of Boris Johnson would maybe argue that he did that by getting Brexit done, if you're a believer in Brexit being a good thing. But with David Lloyd George, things like the creation of the state pension and so on, there's a huge, substantial policy legacy that he left for the whole country.
Yeah, I'd be much more generous in that regard to Lloyd George in contrast to Boris. I'm not convinced that Boris ever believed anything, including the Brexit stuff. And I'm sitting in front of, the book that Lloyd George heavily shaped, Britain's Industrial Future, the Yellow Book in 1928. It's a really serious, substantive document. And of course, he spent a lot of time thinking about how to respond to the slump of the late 20s and 30s, how to reform economic policy. He did have, I think, quite a serious, Lloyd George this is, commitment to social policy reform. And I don't really think that the same things can be said of Boris. I am inclined to think that he always saw Brexit as a way of improving his own career prospects rather than something that he was completely convinced about. So I definitely wouldn't relegate Lloyd George to the Boris Johnson category in politics.
It's interesting, though, that you mention a book, the 1920s there, and the publication from the 20s, because at the beginning of the 1920s, certainly or just before the commencement of the 1920s, the Liberals are one of the dominant political parties in the UK. There is a Liberal Prime Minister. The Labour Party is a small upstart challenger party. By the end of the 1920s, the Liberal Party is split into numerous factions. The Labour Party has displaced the Liberal Party, and the Liberals and then the Liberal Democrats never get into power again until 2010, never subsequently yet had a prime minister. So the 20s politically, in one sense, are a completely disastrous period for the Liberals. But as you mentioned, the 20s is also the period in which we often look back fondly to things like the policy publications, General Election Manifesto, or indeed, if you look at the Lib Dem image stand at a Lib Dem conference, you'll see lots of the 1920 Liberal posters, the ones about the bicycle, about capitalism and socialism and liberalism being like, we love the 1920s, as it were, in terms of policy and propaganda, even though politically they were disastrous for the party. So in writing the book, what was your sort of take in that sense on what went wrong for the Liberals in that decade, even though there are so many things we otherwise think admirable about what the party was sort of doing and saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think it simply was that split, wasn't it, between the Asquith part of the party and Lloyd George, and the failure of both men, really, not just Lloyd George, to see the bigger picture and get the party back working together. And, when Lloyd George then came back, as has been famously noted once, ideas did come back into the party, but the party was by then a much smaller organisation and very deeply split. And when Lloyd George and some of those around him weren't working in the party on the policy side and weren't pushing in the same direction, really the ideas disappeared out of the party. And some of the manifestos that the Liberal Party produced in that period of time when Lloyd George wasn't active were really pretty feeble offerings that showed that the Liberal Party was losing its way at a time when there were many more economic problems in society that demanded some sort of response from government and opposition. And it isn't really surprising that that combination of a lack of ideas when Lloyd George wasn't around, combined with a deep-seated split in the two parts of the party that was never really papered back together again after Lloyd George stabbed Asquith in the back in 1916, that really did do for the party. And it took many decades, as you know, for the party to begin to get its positioning back together, its orientation, and to find policy themes that gave it some life. I mean, arguably it wasn't until the 1960s and Grimond that the party started to get its act together again.
But your book is about much more than just, the David Lloyd George dramas of the 1920s. So in terms of the overall picture that, you draw about relations between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, what's the sort of the main theme or themes that you learned through sort of researching and then writing the book?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that often there is a school of thought in politics that says that Labour and the Liberals are parties that have very similar values and orientation, have worked together and ought to be working together. But actually, looking at the period going back right back to 1903, what's striking is that for much of that time, actually the parties weren't working closely together at all and didn't have the same ideology and were often furiously competing with each other. And of course, for quite a long period of time, from the 30s onwards, for maybe 20 or so years, the Liberal Party only really survived because in many parts of the country, deals were being done with the Conservative Party, either locally or more typically nationally, that allowed Liberal candidates to stand without any Conservative competition. And had those deals not existed, the Liberal Party might well have died out in the 40s or 50s. So it's not surprising that some people in the Labour Party and elsewhere don't see the Liberals as natural allies, because for much of this period of time, they have actually been furious competitors. But at the same time, we have this extraordinary fact that the Labour Party only really got its foot in the parliamentary door in 1903 as a consequence of the deal between MacDonald and Gladstone, the Liberal chief whip, that allowed Labour to stand candidates unopposed by the Liberals in around 30 seats. And at that period of time, there was quite a lot of overlap between the policy agenda of Labour and the Liberals. In some ways, Labour were the radical edge of an increasingly more radical Liberal Party. But once the big dividing line in economic policy in the country was no longer free trade versus tariffs, but more between socialism and capitalism, then it became much more difficult for the Liberals to be aligned with the Labour Party. And arguably, it wasn't really until the Blair government of 1997 onwards that the Liberals and the Labour Party started working again very closely. So perhaps there've only really been two phases of very close cooperation over that long period of years since 1903.
Yeah, and that really surprised me, sort of sitting down to read the book. I mean, I guess I had sort of known it before, but hadn't quite realised I'd known it, just how rare historically those phases of, like, I guess, the last few years in the run up to the 2024 general election as well, where definitely there was, Labour and Liberal Democrats were very much separate parties in the 2024 general election, but almost all of what we were doing in each party was aimed at others. So it was mostly a Labour Conservative or a Lib Dem Conservative fight. There was not very much Labour Lib Dem sort of contest, and whether you consider that sort of ideologically or sort of electorally, I was surprised just how rare it is for there to be those, period, so few years of significant overlap. But you also have quite a nice little appendix at the back, don't you, where you've got a more rigorous model to put some numbers on all of this.
Yes, I mean, what I've done is in the at the back of the book, I've tried to break down the periods of relationship between Labour and the Liberal Democrats since 1903, and I've sort of broken them down to 8 phases. And obviously, this kind of schema is never perfect, but there definitely were some sort of different phases of cooperation and competition between the two parties. So I've looked at that over the period from 1903 right up more or less to the current time, and then also tried to assess the proximity of the two parties and the degree of cooperation on the basis of 5 really key drivers of whether there's going to be competition or whether there's going to be cooperation. And the 5 drivers are, I suppose, fairly obvious things, but I'm not sure that I've ever seen it set out in these terms before. And some of there are some areas that could have been plausibly included in the sort of drivers of cooperation, for example, relations between party leaders, which actually I think are less important. So the drivers I selected are obviously policy alignment, how much are the two parties close together on policy? Is the larger party keen and willing to cooperate, or more in a sort of competitive mode? How big is the smaller party? In other words, is it big enough to have an influence? What is the attitude of the larger party to electoral reform? Because that has been a common factor of interest for the smaller party for the last 100 years. And then what is the size of the majority of the larger party when it's in power? In other words, if there's a Liberal government or a Labour government, is the majority small enough to, in a sense, drive the larger party to be interested in relations with the smaller party? Or does it have an incentive just to ignore the smaller party because the majority it's got is so huge? And those seem to me to be the key factors that determine whether the two parties are working closely together in those phases of history or whether they're much further apart.
And as you say, in a way, they sound very obvious. But what really struck me was if you take the period since the Labour Party became one of the big two parties, so from the end of the 20s onwards, I think your table, and I think rightly, in terms of what it reflects about what happened, only has one period since then in which there's a overwhelming majority of those factors pointing towards Labour Lib Dem sort of warmness, which is the 1992 to 99 period. And you end at 2019, so I guess maybe 2019 onwards might be an issue. But it's really striking that across that huge sweep of time, in a way, that period of politics in the 1990s, which I think for a lot of people of roughly your age or my age, in a sense was quite seminal in setting our expectations about what politics was like and is actually quite the exception, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. And, there are two big reasons for that, I suppose. I mean, one is that we have to appreciate that once Labour elbowed the Liberals aside after the First World War, or started to elbow the Liberals aside, their very deliberate strategy was to crush the Liberal Party and replace them as one of the two big parties of politics. It was not to work with the Liberals at all. And also, particularly once Labour split and divided over economic policy in the late 20s and 30s, and Labour became a more explicitly socialist party, there've been long periods of time when nationalisation, socialism has been pretty central to the Labour programme in a way that makes it very difficult to work with a Liberal Party. And people obviously think of the period when Michael Foot was leader of the Labour Party or Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party pretty recently. But actually, if you look at the Labour manifesto in 1970 and in the period preceding the Lib Lab Pact, it's a very left-wing Labour manifesto that was looking to nationalise all sorts of parts of the economy, take all sorts of control and intervention in the economy in a way that's not really very liberal, and for long periods of time not actually all that pro-European or pro-European community or European Union. So there have been periods of time when policy has really kept the two parties apart as well as competition.
Yeah, and when I first looked at that table at the back, my initial reaction was, "Oh, hang on a minute, this is missing a really big factor. What on earth is going on here?" I think having read the book, I'm persuaded that that initial reaction of mine was wrong. But my initial thought was, well, surely one of the big factors is whether Labour and the Liberal Democrats are both in opposition together or not. Because it feels to me like there's a natural dynamic that if you are both in opposition, you A, have a common opponent in the government who you want to get out, and B, you naturally spend most of your time talking about how you differ from the government rather than how you differ from a rival opposition party. The creation of the SDP being an exception to that period, when obviously there was a lot of talk about, about the split. But generally, that I would expect that the pattern is, well, when the Tories are in power, Labour and Lib Dems move together, and when Labour is in power, they move apart. That doesn't seem to be the pattern, though. Have you got any insight as to why that apparently plausible story actually, when you put it to the test, falls apart?
Yeah, I mean, you're right, I think, to think that it seems obvious that two parties in oppositions should begin to feel closer together. And I remember thinking in 2010, when we were in coalition talks with both Labour and the Conservatives, that one of the reasons that the talks with the Conservatives were much easier is that we were both parties who'd been in opposition, who'd been defined against a Labour government for a very long period of time. And it was easy to agree on all the things that we wanted to throw out and change. Whereas as soon as we went into a coalition talks with the Labour Party, we were dealing with a party that was defending all the things that it had been implementing over the previous decade and really struggled with the idea that it should have to concede change to us. So in a sense, it feels obvious that when parties are in opposition, they should be more inclined to work together. But I think the reasons that that hasn't worked for Labour and the Liberals, Lib Dems for much of the period that I'm looking at is firstly that there have been periods where the parties have been competing very hard for that second place position. So it hasn't been in their incentive to, in their interest to work together. And at other times, there have simply been policy differences that have been too huge to allow the two parties to work together. So for those reasons, I think that the assumption that being in opposition simply leads to proximity hasn't stood up for a lot of this period of time.
And again, I think in that sense, it shows that perhaps the experience of the 1990s was very much the exception rather than, if it was the period that was people's formative experience, it may seem like it was the norm, but actually it turns out the 1990s was rather the exception.
Yes,
which does also make me think in hindsight, all of the talk about whether as it became 2024 general election would be like 1997 or not was perhaps a riskier bit of speculation than it felt at the time.
Yeah, I think that's right.
The other thing that struck me in sort of the parts of the book that are looking at how Liberal and then later Liberal Democrat leaders were trying to find a path to recovery for the party from the 1930s onwards, is until you get to the 1970s, local government doesn't really feature at all. And, that since the 1970s, there very much has been a sense, well, part of the route to recovering from a setback is to get stuck into winning council elections. And the local government base also provides a degree of resilience against, problems in Westminster. But prior to that, it doesn't seem like local government really features at all. And the other thing, though, that struck me, which was perhaps more surprising, was how little local government seems to have been the test bed for cross-party cooperation. Because in many ways, cross-party cooperation at local government level is a lot easier. If informal, on the quiet pacts over seats and not standing candidates and all of that gets massively less attention and scrutiny, generates much less controversy, much harder to know that it's even happened than anything like that happening on the Westminster scale. And certainly since the 1980s, there have been so many councils without a single party majority in the country that there's a necessity of cross-party working to simply run the council. And yet, so despite that, the fact that you might think of local government also as, well, this is the route to warmer relations between the parties because that's the easier route. Again, that doesn't really seem to have been part of the picture. And I wonder, how much do you think that is? Because from the perspective of the story that your book is telling, local government is actually off stage, as it were, not part of the story. Or is it just that there's always a little bit of a risk of getting quite Westminster centric when looking at political history?
I think it's undoubtedly true that this book focuses particularly heavily on Westminster and sees the relationship between the Westminster parties as being the crucial driver of relations, as opposed to what's going on at the local level. When I get on to my second, third, and fourth edition of the book, perhaps I'll add, prompted by you and others, a section on local government, because it would be interesting to look at it. My hunch is that it won't make a fundamental difference to the story that I'm telling about ideology and competition between the two parties, but it would highlight that pragmatism around working with other parties, doing deals, is much more already part of the UK political system because it's been there in local government. Whereas, as you say, it's regarded as something that's quite radical and unusual at Westminster. And you'll remember that in the 2010 coalition talks, one of the members of the negotiating team that Nick Clegg put together was Lord Stunnell, now sadly not with us, but he played a major part in that team. And I do remember him once saying, when we were all sort of expressing our views about the challenges of negotiations and doing deals, I remember him saying something like, you do realize we've been doing this for years at local government, and actually, you know, we need to be very pragmatic and hard-nosed about this. And I also kind of realized from that Andrew came to the table with no automatic assumption that talks would lead to one particular outcome where only, you know, two of the parties could work together. He was used to a situation in local government where you had to acknowledge what the maths looked like and work with people, even if they weren't people that you normally expected that you'd be in cooperation with. So there is a sort of pragmatism, I think, around local government, which might shed some additional light on the story that I tell. But I don't think, even if I'd included a large section on those local government relations over the last few decades in particular, that it would have hugely changed my conclusions about the key drivers of cooperation between the two parties at a national level.
Yeah, and it may be that, in a way, the most interesting thing about the contrast with local government is asking why local government is different. Why does there, since the 1980s at least onwards, seem to have been much more political space for cross-party working at local government level than there is at parliamentary level? And part of that answer is that one-party majorities on councils are less common. But even if you then look at the periods when in the Westminster Parliament there hasn't been a one-party majority, it nonetheless feels like there is something structurally or psychologically quite different about how Westminster politics operates from local government. And maybe there are some interesting thoughts about political reform that would come out of that. So I do hope you add that chapter at some point, wherever at the end.
I may well do. And I mean, it may also be that this is less sensitive and difficult and is more pragmatic at a local government level, because local government in this country is still, as you know, fairly tightly constrained by national government policy. And that therefore means that the range of ideological differences and policy differences and differences of approach that you can take at local government are arguably quite a lot less than the flexibilities at a national government level. That means, I think, that different political parties probably find it more easy to work together because there are simply fewer things that it's possible for them to disagree on. But that's a hypothesis, perhaps, rather than something coming out of any analysis.
And certainly, I guess there's a plausible counter hypothesis, which would be that the very smallness of the policy differences is when you might expect the ideological showboating to be at its greatest. You know, that actually it's the smallness of the differences that often makes things most fractious, because people don't actually have big substantive things to disagree on. So I think, yeah, there is an interesting story to be told there, whether it's in a future chapter of hopefully a paperback edition of your book, or if anyone who's listening may indeed be
absolutely
write a book on that. But we should return to what is in your book.
Yes.
And talked a little bit about David Lloyd George. But I think the other thing, though, that comes through the book is, although I think you're very sympathetic to the political dilemmas that Liberal and then Liberal Democrat Party leaders faced, overall, it's not a particularly positive picture that you paint about how successfully they grappled with what should the relationship with the Labour Party be. And I think, as with many other people, myself included, in terms of my own views, you're quite critical in some ways of what David Steele did with the Lib Lab Pact, of how little there was to show for it. Although you also, I think, do give the other side of the story a fair airing about the importance and the symbolism of the Lib Lab Pact. But overall, it feels like one of the stories from your book is just faced with that question of negotiating with Labour at various different occasions. The party doesn't do very well at it. Is that a bit an interpretation of mine, or?
That would be a fair interpretation, but I think it's worth distinguishing between two problems. One is that at times we've had quite impressive Liberal leaders, like Steele in particular, and arguably Grimond to a lesser extent, who have had a strategy for the party, but unfortunately the strategy has had nowhere to go because the Labour Party has not been interested in the strategy. I mean, the Labour Party has either been far too left-wing to deal with successfully, or too split as it was arguably in the 1970s, or simply disinterested in the approach that the Liberals wanted to take. And arguably what both Grimond and Steele needed is the Labour Party to split and present an opportunity for the Liberals and the right of the Labour Party to make common cause. But Steele and Grimond could wish for that. They couldn't deliver it. And then I suppose there's been a separate problem, which is that at other times, for example, when Paddy Ashdown was leader in the late 90s, it may simply be that we wanted Labour to give more than they could deliver. I mean, it's ironic that I was director of policy working for Paddy at the time that he was involved with Blair, pre-97 and just after it. And I remember, as you will, that many people around the party were particularly worried that Paddy would end up being so enthusiastic about being into coalition with Blair that he would concede far too much, not push for electoral reform with enough strength and conviction, and that we would end up having given too much away for too little. So it's ironic in the light of that when I wrote the chapter about Lib-Lab relations under Blair and Ashdown for this book, I concluded that Paddy's problem was not that he pushed for too little, but that he pushed for too much. And that with the size of Blair's majority in 97 and then in 2001, he was simply not going to get Blair to concede electoral reform on the scale of the nature that he was advocating and that Roy Jenkins advocated. And arguably our mistake then was not to concede a referendum on a more timid first step electoral reform, in other words, the alternative vote, which we probably would have been granted by Labour back then, and which might have allowed change in the electoral system to be made and to lead on to further change, hopefully, down the road. So I think there have been the history of Liberal leaders' management of the opportunities here hasn't been great, but sometimes it hasn't been great because the Labour Party has simply not been in the right place for it. And sometimes maybe we've not been realistic in asking for things that could be delivered.
And perhaps also it's just a reflection that being the smaller party in those sorts of situations, you actually have a very weak hand to play. And so the reason that we can pick over each of these leaders and their record and think, well, you shouldn't have played that hand that way or this way. But the real underlying story is actually none of them had a particularly good hand, which sort of fits with, I guess, my little pet theory that, we've often viewed in the party as hung parliaments as the promised land. Obviously slightly tarnished after the 2010 experience, but this is the promised land where we'll have power and be able to get things. And actually, you look at hung parliaments in practice over the century or so, they end somewhere from disappointing to catastrophic. There aren't any of them that end brilliantly, with this slight exception of technically the parliament was hung for a little bit in the advance of the 1997 election, but that sort of technical occasion. And so maybe it is just fundamentally being the smaller party, particularly not being one of the two big parties in a two-party system, you're always, it's going to require a remarkable alignment of luck or a completely different strategy. And perhaps, therefore, the sympathy about the weak hand should maybe be tempered slightly by thinking, well, actually, if the hand is always going to be weak, maybe the strategy needs to be different.
Yeah, you're right that these opportunities, the real opportunities for electoral reform, are only going to come up very infrequently. And they require both parties, or two parties at least, to understand that there is an opportunity, and the larger party to be in a position to deliver change, but to be sufficiently nervous about its future prospects to be willing to concede something to the smaller party. So this is not easy. And as you rightly say, the evidence of the last 100 or so years suggests that the Liberals don't always do badly automatically when Labour are in power, but they have done disastrously badly almost always where there is a coalition, a pact between the two parties, or even where there are parliaments, where there is a hung parliament or a majority which is so small that the electorate, the British electorate, is invited at a forthcoming election to swing away from, the Liberals in order to deliver a clear majority that will allow for strong government. So narrow wins by one party and hung parliaments have tended to be pretty fatal to the Liberals and Liberal Democrats. And a Liberal leader still has to figure out how to navigate through all of these rocks that threaten the sort of party vessel.
Yeah, and having said all that, though, I think there is one example outside of Westminster that was undoubtedly successful, both politically and electorally, politically in terms of policy delivery and electorally, which was the sequence of hung parliaments in the Scottish Parliament, where the Liberal Democrats were in coalition with Labour over a couple of occasions. And I know you played a bit of a role in at least the initial coalition talks in Scotland. What's the sort of lesson you draw from that as to why? What is it that makes that sequence of successes in Scotland stand out in such contrast to all of these other, failed attempts or even worse than failed attempts in Westminster?
Yeah, I think on Scotland from 99 onwards, there is some good news and there's some bad news. The good news is that in 99, nobody was surprised that the Lib Dems and Labour ended up in coalition together. So in a sense, there were fewer electors to upset when that actually happened because it was a likely scenario. We had already a PR system that we were dealing with. So we had in some senses the protection of PR when we went into coalition and working with another party. There were some high profile political issues around things like tuition fees that helped the party in 99 in Scotland to differentiate itself from the Labour Party. And it was, of course, a period when the economy was doing much better, when additional public spending taps were being turned on in Westminster. So it was a bit, we were not having to make the same difficult decisions that were being made after 2010. So there were some sort of positive messages around that and some lessons to be learned. However, it is also worth saying that those coalitions in 1999 to 2007 were taking place in Scotland at a time when the party was out of power at a national level and increasingly was differentiating itself from the Labour Party under Charles Kennedy's leadership, with the war in Iraq and so forth, the Conservative Party still effectively being on their knees. So those coalitions were taking place in Scotland at a time when the national opinion poll rating was going upwards, giving protection to the situation in Scotland, and where the Liberal Democrat identity nationally was very different from the National Labour Party because of issues like underfunding of public services and particularly the war in Iraq. So that meant that the same sort of compromise to the party's identity in Scotland that happened to the party nationally when we went into coalition in 2010 didn't occur, because you got that distinction between Lib Dems and Labour at Westminster that was offsetting any sense in Scotland that the Lib Dems and Labour was simply people that were, working too closely together. So I think that helped to protect the Lib Dem identity in Scotland in that period of time, and the rising opinion poll ratings nationally of the Lib Dems over that period helped to sort of protect us in Scotland.
Yeah, and I guess as well that there was a decision to prioritize particular policy asks that felt like they added up to a more distinctive Lib Dem sort of contribution, perhaps, than I think in hindsight in the 2010 to 15 period in Westminster. So I think of the £10,000 income tax allowance policy as an example, an excellent policy in all sorts of ways in terms of helping some of the least well off in the country. but fundamentally it meant one of our big wins was getting income tax cut, which felt like to most voters, well, that's, at least back then, what you sort of expected of the Tories. And while it was technically true and we loved saying, oh no, David Cameron had said he wouldn't do it and all of that, and this is what we've got done, it maybe didn't just at that broader brush level feel as distinctively Lib Dem as maybe some of the choices that Scottish colleagues made in that Scottish coalition era.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, the Tories were clever in the way they managed a lot of these sort of policy issues between us, in that even where there were things they didn't necessarily agree with in that coalition period, if they made a judgment that they were going to be popular with the public, they got as close to us as possible on them and tried to claim all the credit. I mean, universal infant free school meals were one example. A lot of Conservatives didn't really like the policy, and we had people like Dom Cummings trying to undermine it. But I was always clear that Cameron and Osborne could see that this was something that polled quite well, and they were just going to row in as close to Nick as possible on it and try to get as much credit for it as possible, just as they did on the £10,000 allowance. They never wanted to do it. They had to be bullied in every single budget to make it a priority. But as soon as it was announced, they turned it into a coalition policy and not a Lib Dem one. And our desire to have a working, functional relationship and show that a coalition could work as a constructive adult thing, in a sense, worked too well, because it meant that we simply didn't have enough really big arguments on popular Lib Dem policies that we ended up sort of bludgeoning into the policy program. Most of the good things, even things like equal marriage, ended up being things that both Nick and Cameron were advocating for. So that and other things made it much more difficult, I think, for people to see the added value of the Lib Dems in coalition. We could see it, and we were confident that we were doing great things. But I wonder whether other people really saw that. And I remember in particular, Nick, halfway through the coalition, saying that he was thinking of letting a sort of BBC camera crew come in and follow him for a few weeks and watch what he did. And somebody said, oh God, is that a good idea? These things usually go wrong. And Nick said, look, I literally don't think that people in the country know what I do. I've got this job as Deputy Prime Minister. It is incredibly powerful. I'm taking decisions every day that make a huge difference to the country, hopefully for the better. But actually, all they see is Cameron Prime Minister at PMQs, Cameron coming out of the door of number 10. Danny, very powerful in the Treasury, but he's the deputy also to the Chancellor, and it's the Chancellor that delivers the budget. And we really didn't think about those things enough at the beginning of the coalition. We had a slightly nice Lib Dem naive view that if we did all the right things and we got the right policy outcomes, eventually people would recognise that and give us credit for it. And I think we did not think enough about whether people could spot what we were doing or understand it and give us any credit for it.
And I think returning to the bigger picture, I guess maybe one of the lessons as well there is that given the overall Tory-leaning nature of much of our media, that in a way, being in some way in cooperation with the Labour Party is probably fundamentally easier to make work than with the Conservatives, not just because of, maybe issues about relative sort of policy and ideological proximity, but also because if you're trying to persuade the Telegraph that we're doing good stuff and the Tories aren't, that's a really hard sell. But if you're trying to persuade the Telegraph that we're doing good stuff and Labour aren't, actually there's a chance there. And the Tory-leaning nature of the press perhaps makes efforts like 2010 to 15 all the harder to pull off successfully, and maybe in part why the Scottish Parliament's experience was so much more positive.
You might be right, but I wouldn't underestimate how, for parts of our media, a determination to kill the sort of centre-left, come what may, is a very high priority. And I remember some senior people in the media world telling us just after we did the coalition in 2010, we're so pleased you went in with the Conservatives rather than Labour, and we've got the front pages of the newspaper lined up for the moment you made the mistake of propping up the Labour Party, where we would have killed you and dumped, endless attacks on you day after day after day until you were sort of eliminated. So, yeah, I think that I'm not sure that under any scenario you're going to get an easy ride in government from many parts of the media as a Liberal Party at the moment.
So trying to reach for something more positive to end on.
Yes.
Thinking across that broad sweep of both your own experiences in Westminster and helping in Scotland, and obviously what you've done for the book. Any particular lesson, helpful words of wisdom you would offer Liberal Democrats in the next few years if any of these issues do become prominent ones in our politics again, about relationships with other parties?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the moment there are so many risks and so many dangers for a Liberal and Lib Dem party at a time when Labour has come to power without a very sort of clear agenda, perhaps with a team that's not as strong as it was in 1997, with the government already going down very steeply in the polls and really struggling. And those could all seem to be quite good reasons for the Lib Dems keeping quite a big distance from Labour. I certainly think the party will need to be very cautious about its approach to the government. However, this is otherwise one of those periods where I think on policy and values, the two parties look much closer together than they've been for most of that history from 1903 onwards. And we may be in one of those unique periods where we've got a government that does have the ability in Parliament to make change and to put political reform through Westminster. And in spite of having the power itself to do that, might also understand the reason for using that power now, rather than simply assuming that it's going to be all right, or leave things until it's desperate. Because actually we've got a government that's got this enormous mandate in Parliament, but based on a feebly, pathetically low share of the vote, and with huge numbers of seats, with really very small majorities that could melt away at very short notice. So it seems to me that although it's a time of very great risk in terms of trying to effect reform, it's also arguably one of the periods of greatest opportunity for a Lib Dem party that still believes in political reform and needs to find others who will be partners in delivering it. It may be that there is an opportunity over the next few years that is greater than that there has been for a very long period of time, and that if missed, won't come back for many decades to come.
An intriguing thought, and I think it reflects how it feels like politics is much more interesting, exciting, and open than I would have expected it if you'd asked me a year ago to say, well, if the next general election sees Labour win with a big majority, I would have said, well, I guess the Parliament will be relatively dull, a bit like the 97 to 2001 Parliament. Yeah. And that's definitely not how politics is turning out. So whilst the past is never a sure guide to the future, I definitely recommend to everyone listening to get David's book, because it certainly helps understand how the future might play out. I will include links to both your new book, David, and the Lord Kitchener book in the show notes. And thank you very much for your time on the show today. And thank you very much to everyone for listening. If you did enjoy listening, please do tell others about this podcast and give it a rating or review in your favourite podcast app to send some helpful data this podcast's way. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, Mark.